The town always woke before the sun, not because it was eager, but because it had learned that waiting did no good. By the time the first pale light crept over the low hills, dust already hung in the air, lifted by boots, hooves, and the long memory of heat that never quite left the ground. You could smell it everywhere, that mix of dry earth, manure, old wood, and coffee boiled too long. Sounds carried far in a place like this. A latch clicking open. A cough behind a wall. The low complaint of cattle shifting in their pens. It was a town that listened, even when it pretended not to. I was part of it, whether I liked to admit that or not. Elias Calder, horse trainer by trade, neighbor by habit, witness by default. I lived just far enough from the main street that folks forgot me, until they needed a problem made quieter, or an animal made gentler. I liked it that way. Animals tell the truth with their bodies. People rarely do. Still, every morning I rode in, tied my horse to the same post, and felt the town take note of me the way it noted everything. Without warmth. Without malice. Just watching. That morning carried the same weight as any other until it didn't. A stagecoach came in low and slow, wheels groaning like tired bones. No one rushed to it. Strangers arrived all the time, chasing rumors of work or running from names they no longer wished to answer to. But when she stepped down, the town shifted. Not loudly. Not enough to point at. Just a subtle lean, like grass bending when something passes through it. She was not dressed for spectacle. A plain brown dress, mended at the elbows, a small valise held close as if it might bolt. Her hair was pinned neatly, though the wind kept worrying loose strands around her face. What struck me first was how still she stood after her boots hit the dirt. As though she were bracing herself for a blow she had already learned to endure. Her name, I would learn later, was Maribel Rowan. At that moment, she was simply the woman everyone began to measure without permission. Men did what they always do when something unfamiliar arrives. They smiled too quickly. They spoke too loudly. Women watched from doorways and windows, eyes sharp with a knowledge they would never admit to carrying. I saw Clinton Hargreave near the saloon steps, hat tipped back, grin already forming. Clinton lived for an audience. He was handsome in a shallow way, quick with jokes that landed because they were cruel enough to feel daring. When he laughed, others followed, relieved to be told what was acceptable. Someone said something I couldn't quite hear, and Clinton's grin widened. He glanced at Maribel, then back to his friends, and I saw the joke being born before it was ever spoken aloud. It passed between them like a spark, fed by boredom and the unspoken agreement that humiliation counted as entertainment if the right person was chosen. Send her to Clinton, I heard someone mutter later. See what she expects. Let her learn. Maribel walked on, unaware or pretending to be. She stopped at the boarding house, Mrs. Alden Pike appearing in the doorway with her usual frown softened by curiosity. They spoke briefly. Maribel nodded too many times, a habit of someone used to agreeing. When she turned back toward the street, Clinton stepped forward, all easy confidence and practiced charm. I couldn't hear their words, but I saw the way her shoulders eased, just a fraction, as if hope were something she allowed herself in careful doses. I told myself it was none of my business. That was a lie I had learned to tell well. I brushed down a horse, checked a loose shoe, listened to the town hum around me. Laughter drifted from the saloon. A piano tried and failed to hold a tune. Clinton and Maribel passed by once, his voice animated, hers barely rising above the noise. People noticed. Of course they did. The town liked its stories simple, liked its roles clearly marked. By afternoon, the heat pressed down hard enough to make tempers thin. I saw Maribel alone near the dry goods store, her face pale beneath the sun. Clinton was nowhere to be seen. A few men watched her from the shade, murmuring. One of them laughed. Not kindly. Not even loudly. It was the sort of sound meant to be shared. She lifted her chin and kept walking. Dignity carried like a fragile thing she refused to set down. That was the moment something in me shifted, quiet but undeniable. I recognized that look in her eyes. I had worn it myself once, after my wife died, and the town decided my grief made them uncomfortable. I had survived by becoming useful, by making myself small and steady and hard to provoke. Maribel looked as though she had survived by enduring, by letting storms pass over her, without believing they defined the sky. As the sun slid low, the joke completed its slow, ugly arc. Clinton returned to the saloon with a story he told too loudly, gesturing with his glass. Laughter followed him like a reward. Maribel did not. I saw her cross the street alone, head bowed now, steps measured. Mrs. Pike opened the boarding-house door without knocking. The door closed behind them, firm and final. I stood there longer than I needed to, reins loose in my hand, dust settling on my boots. The town exhaled, satisfied. Another lesson delivered. Another evening's entertainment secured. I told myself again that it was none of my business. The lie tasted worse this time. Because as the light faded and the first lamps were lit, I understood something with a clarity that startled me. The town had chosen its cruelty, and without ever speaking a word, it had asked me to choose mine as well. Night came in slow layers. The sky bruised purple, then deepened, stars pricking through like hesitant thoughts. Lamps glowed along the street, throwing uneven light that made faces look stranger than they were. Somewhere a woman sang softly, the tune wandering without finding its way home. I watered my horse and lingered, listening, pretending there was work left to do. From the boarding-house window, a faint light burned. A shadow crossed it once, twice. Maribel moving, perhaps unpacking, perhaps sitting very still. I imagined the weight settling in her chest, the quiet accounting of what had been lost in a single afternoon. I should have gone home. Instead, I stayed until the street emptied and the laughter thinned, until even Clinton's voice faded. As I rode away, the town fell behind me. I told myself tomorrow would be the same. Yet the image of her standing by the stagecoach, braced against a blow, followed me down the dark road, and I knew with a certainty that made my hands tighten on the reins that this story had already begun to move, and it would not leave either of us untouched at all. Morning came without mercy. Sunlight spilled across the town in a hard, pale wash that left no corner untouched, no shadow deep enough to hide in. Heat rose early, lifting the smell of dust and iron and yesterday's spilled whiskey back into the air. By the time I rode in, sweat already traced slow lines down my spine, and the street had begun its daily performance of pretending nothing ever changed. Doors opened. Boots struck boards. The same men claimed the same stools as if routine itself could keep the world from shifting beneath them. Maribel stepped out of the boarding-house just after breakfast. I noticed because I had been watching the door more than I cared to admit. She wore the same brown dress, freshly brushed now, the men's careful and proud. Her hair was pinned tighter, as if she had decided to meet the day on her own terms. She paused on the steps, breathing once, then twice, like someone steadying themselves before crossing a river. When she moved, she did so with purpose, though her eyes stayed low, reading the ground as if it might warn her of what lay ahead. Clinton Hargreave noticed her too. He was already loud, already performing, his voice carrying from the saloon porch as he held court for anyone willing to listen. When he saw her, his expression shifted into something polished and inviting, a mask he wore well. He stepped down to meet her, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. People nearby slowed, their attention snagged by the promise of a story. I told myself again that it was none of my business. I told myself I had work to do. The lies felt thinner in the daylight. They walked together down the street, Clinton talking, Maribel listening. I passed them once, close enough to catch fragments of his voice, smooth and practiced. He spoke of the town as if it were generous, as if it rewarded those who tried hard enough to belong. She nodded when he paused, the motion small, almost apologetic. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when she glanced up at him, and something like relief crossed her face. It struck me then how little kindness it takes to change the shape of a day. The morning unfolded in pieces I could not quite look away from. Clinton led her into the dry goods store, emerging with a bolt of ribbon she did not carry. He guided her across the street toward the cafe, holding the door too long, bowing slightly as if the gesture itself were the point. Laughter followed them, not unkind on the surface, but edged with something sour. A few men exchanged looks that said they knew where this was going and found comfort in that knowledge. By midday, the sun pressed down hard enough to make tempers brittle. Clinton's attention began to wander. He left Maribel standing while he greeted friends, his hand lingering on her arm just long enough to feel possessive, not long enough to feel reassuring. She waited where he left her, eyes scanning the street, posture composed. When he returned, his words came quicker, looser, already shaped by the promise of an audience. It ended the way these things always do. Not with a shout. Not with a slap. Just a moment that fell wrong. Clinton laughed at something someone else said, and did not look back at her when she spoke. He gestured toward the street as if dismissing a thought or a person, and stepped away without explanation. The men with him laughed, louder now, the sound ringing out too clearly in the open air. Maribel stood there, the space beside her suddenly conspicuous. She waited a breath longer than she should have, then turned and walked. I saw her pass the hitching post where my horse stood, her face carefully blank. A flush crept up her neck, betraying her effort. Someone muttered a joke behind her. Someone else snorted. The town accepted the offering it had been promised. I felt something tighten in my chest, an old anger I had believed long settled. It had been a long time since I had wanted to interrupt a man in the middle of his cruelty. I did not move. That failure would stay with me longer than I knew. Maribel did not cry in the street. She did not run. She walked back to the boarding house with the same measured steps, as if dignity were something she could hold on to by force of will alone. Mrs. Pike met her at the door, one eyebrow lifting in question. Maribel shook her head once. That was all. Inside, the door closed gently, sealing the quiet away from the noise. The afternoon dragged. The laughter lingered longer than it deserved. Clinton told his story twice more, each time sharpening the edges, making himself the center. By the third telling, he had already begun to forget her name. I finished my work with hands that felt clumsy, distracted by the image of her standing alone, the moment hope slipped from her grasp. When the heat finally eased, I rode out of town, dust rising behind me like a second thought I could not shake. That evening, I found myself thinking of the ways humiliation takes root. How it thrives in daylight, fed by witnesses who tell themselves they are only watching. I remembered my own losses, the looks that followed me like questions no one dared ask. By nightfall, the town had moved on to new distractions. I had not. The next morning, she was back on the street. The same dress. The same careful composure. Only now there was something else in her eyes, a guardedness that had not been there before. She moved more quickly, as if the open spaces had grown dangerous overnight. Clinton did not approach her again. He had gotten what he wanted. The joke had run its course. I saw her pause outside the feed store, studying the notice board as though it might offer answers. For the first time, she looked uncertain, not of herself, but of the ground she stood on. The town watched again, curious to see what shape her endurance would take. I realized then that this was not over. Humiliation, once delivered, demands a response. And whether I liked it or not, the next move would tell me exactly who I was willing to be. The first time I spoke to her, it was not meant to matter. That is how most turning points disguise themselves. I was at the edge of the livery, loosening a knot that had been tied too tight, when I felt someone standing near enough to cast a shadow that was not mine. I looked up expecting Jonah Reed, the stable boy who lingered like a stray dog hoping for purpose. Instead I saw Maribel Rowan, hands folded at her waist, eyes fixed not on me, but on the horse breathing steadily beside us. She waited, patient as if patience were the only language she trusted. I asked if she needed something. The words came out plain, unadorned, the way I spoke to animals and to men I did not wish to impress. She hesitated, then said Mrs. Pike had mentioned I sometimes needed help with small things. Her voice was quieter than the street but steady, like water moving under stones. She did not mention Clinton. She did not mention the laughter. She did not offer an explanation. I told her I could use an extra pair of hands for a few days, nothing complicated, nothing public. She nodded once, relief flickering through her face before she pressed it back down. She arrived the next morning before the heat set in, sleeves rolled, hair pinned tight. I showed her how I liked the feed measured, how the tack should be hung so it did not twist the leather. She listened the way people do, when they have learned mistakes cost more than silence. When she finished a task, she stood waiting for the next, not asking, not assuming. It struck me how rarely anyone waits without demanding something in return. Work has a way of softening edges when it is shared. The rhythm of it settled between us, a language made of small movements and unspoken understandings. She learned quickly. She worked carefully. When a nervous mare shied, Maribel did not jump back. She held still, breathing slow, letting the animal find its own calm. I watched that more closely than I should have. It told me something important about her, something no rumor ever could. We did not speak much at first. That suited us both. Silence, when it is chosen, can feel like shelter. I noticed how she relaxed when no one was watching, how the tight line of her shoulders eased when the street noise faded. Once, when Jonah spilled a bucket and apologized too many times, she smiled at him, a brief, genuine thing that seemed to surprise her as much as it did me. The boy followed her around after that, eager to earn that smile again. By the third day, the town had begun to notice. It always does. A woman working beside a man invites conclusions. I felt the weight of eyes on us when I rode in with her walking a few steps behind, respectful of a distance neither of us had named. Clinton watched once from across the street, his mouth twisting into something that might have been amusement or annoyance. Maribel did not look at him. I wondered if that was a choice or a necessity. We shared water beneath the cottonwood at midday, the shade thin but welcome. She thanked me for the work, the words careful, as if she feared gratitude might be mistaken for debt. I told her she was earning her keep and then some. She glanced at me then, really looked, as though measuring whether I meant it. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. She drank and said nothing more. It was there, in that narrow pocket of quiet, that she told me a little of herself. Not a story meant to persuade or to wound. Just facts laid down gently. She had come west because staying had become impossible. She had learned to start over more than once. People often decided who she was before she had a chance to speak. She did not say this bitterly. It was simply the shape of her experience. I listened without interrupting, without offering the hollow comfort of quick assurances. When she finished, the cicadas filled the space where words might have gone. Something shifted then, subtle but unmistakable. She straightened, as if setting down a weight she had been carrying alone. I realized with a quiet shock that she felt safer speaking to me than to anyone else in town. That knowledge settled heavily in my chest. Safety is a fragile thing. It demands care. I found myself telling her things I rarely shared. About the years after my wife died, when the town did not know what to do with a man who no longer fit their easy narratives. About how animals had saved me from turning inward entirely. I did not frame it as confession. It was simply truth, offered without expectation. Maribel listened the way she worked, attentive and unhurried. As days passed, the work expanded naturally. She began mending harnesses, her stitches neat and strong. She hummed sometimes, so softly it barely registered as sound. The town's whispers grew sharper, but they no longer reached her the same way. I could see it in her stride, in the way she met Mrs. Pike's eyes without flinching. She was still cautious, still wounded, but something in her had begun to root itself. One afternoon, a customer made a comment meant to remind her of her place. I felt anger rise, quick and hot. Before I could speak, Maribel answered him herself. Not sharply. Not submissively. She stated a fact, calm and clear, and returned to her work. The man flushed and turned away. I watched her hands steady on the leather, and understood that strength does not always announce itself. That night, as I walked her back toward the boarding house, the sky wide and pink above us, she thanked me again. This time, there was something else in her voice. Trust, perhaps. Or the beginning of it. I told her she was welcome to stay as long as she liked. The words surprised me with their certainty. She paused at the door, fingers resting on the frame, and looked at me with an expression I could not quite name. Hope, edged with fear. Then she went inside, leaving me alone with the knowledge that the town had not finished with her, and that neither, it seemed, had I. The town has a memory that stretches longer than its streets. It recalls every slight, every misstep, every quiet challenge to its invisible rules, and it waits for the right moment to remind you that survival here is as much about compliance as endurance. That morning, I felt it shift before I even reached the street. Dust swirled along the edges of the boardwalks, carried by the low wind that had begun to stir, and with it came the weight of attention, subtle but unmistakable, like the pressure of a tide rising slowly beneath the sand. I knew before seeing them that something had changed. Maribel was already outside, standing near the livery gate, sleeves rolled, hands folded at her waist, her posture tight and deliberate. She looked as if she were bracing herself, though for what I could not say. Her gaze moved briefly to me as I approached, steady and aware, but quickly returned to the street. The town had begun its inspection. Faces appeared at windows, from doorways, and behind barrels stacked in front of the general store. They whispered just below audible level, but whispers in a town like this carry far. Clinton Hargreave lingered near the saloon, an expression that combined amusement with impatience. He had recovered from his previous attempts at entertainment, but his pride would not allow him to ignore Maribel's presence entirely. When he noticed her, he tipped his hat with the practiced casualness of a man used to seeing the world bend to his gestures. A few of the younger men followed his gaze, smirking, eager to see the continuation of a story they had only half understood. I did not intervene. I could feel a tension coil in my chest, low and insistent, but I told myself again that my place was at the edge, quiet and careful. I watched as the town took its measure of her, as if she were an experiment, and I realized that the same people who had laughed when she arrived were now unsettled by her composure. That composure, I saw clearly, was more potent than any demonstration of strength. She moved with purpose toward the blacksmith, carrying a small bundle of cloth, her steps light but determined. The town followed in the way shadows follow the sun, silent and inexorable. Clinton called out something, half a joke, half a command. She ignored him. He called again, sharper, his tone laced with authority and expectation. Still, she did not turn. The town held its breath. The blacksmith, an older man named Thaddeus Cole, glanced up from the anvil, expression thoughtful. He said nothing, simply nodded in recognition, and she entered the shop. The doorway framed her briefly, sunlight cutting a sharp line across her face, highlighting the set of her jaw, the focus in her eyes. The silence that followed her entry was remarkable, almost reverent. For once, the town seemed unsure how to respond. I stepped closer to the stable, pretending to check the tack, but listening. Her voice floated out after a few moments, calm, precise. She requested the tools she needed and began arranging them herself. Clinton moved closer, hands brushing against the doorframe, face tight with irritation. His intended audience had not laughed. The town's uncertainty seemed to embolden her. By noon, the heat pressed down, relentless. The scent of iron from the blacksmith's forge mingled with dust and dry hay, the smell of the street thickening like paint. Clinton attempted to intervene directly, stepping between her and a bundle of tools she was carrying. He leaned slightly, speaking loudly, attempting to reclaim the space he imagined was his to command. She did not falter. Instead, she adjusted the load in her arms and sidestepped him, quiet as a shadow, deliberate as a river-cutting stone. The men watching muttered amongst themselves, shifting their weight from heel to toe. Some of the women began to appear in doorways, their curiosity tempered by admiration they would not admit aloud. Even Jonah, the boy who usually trailed her work with eager eyes, paused to observe. There was a subtle thrill in seeing the unspoken challenge unfold. A woman, quiet yet resolute, refusing to acknowledge the authority the town presumed over her. I felt something in me twist, a combination of anger and reluctant awe. I wanted to intervene, to step between her and the expectation of compliance, but I held back, aware that action could both protect and strip away her agency. Instead, I let her demonstrate the truth of her endurance, of her right to occupy the world on her terms. Watching her navigate that space, I understood why the town would be unsettled. Strength is rarely quiet, it is almost always uncomfortable to witness. As the afternoon waned, Clinton grew impatient. He tried again, louder this time, trying to draw attention with a flourish of words meant to amuse the crowd. She did not look at him, did not react. He attempted a gesture, a casual brush of his hand against the bundle she carried. Her response was subtle but deliberate. She shifted her weight, stepped aside, and allowed the motion to pass without acknowledgement. That small act spoke louder than any shout. I felt the crowd stir, the balance of power tilting in ways no one had predicted. When she left the blacksmith, carrying her tools, her movements were careful but confident. The town seemed to realize, collectively, that she had refused the script they had written for her. Clinton's expression flickered between disbelief and irritation. For the first time, the performance he relied upon to assert his authority failed. People adjusted their positions, some stepping back, some leaning forward, curious to see what she would do next. We walked together toward the boarding house later, the sun low enough that shadows stretched across the street, elongating every figure and making the familiar strange. The air carried the scent of dust, hay, and a faint tang of metal from the forge. Her silence spoke volumes. I did not attempt to fill it with words, recognizing that sometimes the absence of speech communicates more clearly than any argument. She paused briefly at a corner, glancing toward the saloon. Clinton was there watching, but he did not move. His pride had been punctured, and for once, he was forced into stillness. Maribel did not look at him. Her gaze remained forward, steady, as if acknowledging a threat without granting it power. The street seemed to hold its breath, the town's rhythm slowed, waiting for the inevitable collapse of her resolve. It did not come. When we reached the boarding house, Mrs. Pike appeared at the door, her face composed but her eyes sharp. Maribel handed her tools with care, nodded, and entered. The door closed softly behind her, cutting off the ambient noise of the street, leaving only the quiet of the evening and the scent of wood and supper wafting through the air. I lingered outside, aware of the tension that had shifted but not dissipated. The town had pushed, had tested, had assumed. She had answered without spectacle, with quiet authority, and in doing so, she had unsettled more than one expectation. I realized then that the conflict we all faced was not merely external. It was woven through the way the town perceived strength and worth, through the assumptions men made about women, through the delicate balance of pride and humility that governs survival here. Maribel had refused to comply with a cruel narrative, and in that refusal, she had drawn the eyes of everyone, including mine, into a deeper reckoning. As twilight fell, the lamps were lit along the boardwalk, spilling circles of yellow light onto the dusty street. The sounds softened. A horse shifted in its pen, a door closed somewhere, footsteps echoed faintly along the wooden boards. Maribel's shadow appeared briefly in the doorway, long and steady, then retreated inside. I remained outside, the quiet pressing against me in the way it always does before a storm. There was a moment, brief but weighty, when I understood that her endurance alone had begun to rewrite the expectations of the town. She had navigated the scrutiny, the subtle coercions, and the deliberate attempts at humiliation, and had emerged intact, unbowed. Yet the town's memory is long, and I knew the next wave of tests would come. The shift she had created was real, but fragile, like embers glowing beneath ash, waiting to ignite again. I mounted my horse, the reins loose in my hands, and rode slowly down the empty street. The heat of the day had left the boards warm, the air scented with dry grass and the faint smoke of supper fires. I could see the windows of the boarding house glowing faintly, and inside, Maribel moved, methodical, composed, careful. I did not know what the next day would bring, but I felt in my chest the beginning of a responsibility I could not deny, to witness and perhaps to act. As I rode into the dusking light, the town fading behind me, I realized that her quiet defiance had changed the shape of the day, had altered the unspoken rules. The streets would not forget, and neither would the people who had watched. But there was more than that. Something unspoken passed between us in the moments when the street fell silent, when the sun touched the horizon and the heat relented, when the world seemed to hold its breath. I felt, with a weight I could not yet name, that the next encounter would demand more than endurance. It would demand courage from both of us, the sort that leaves you exposed but alive, the sort that shapes the heart as surely as the forge shapes metal. And in that recognition, I understood that the story had shifted. The town had tested her, she had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, I had begun to see not just her strength, but the quiet, relentless call of what might come next. The street remained empty, but the tension lingered like a faint hum beneath the boards, a promise that the balance had not yet settled. Maribel's shadow behind the boarding-house door flickered once more in the fading light. And I knew with certainty that tomorrow and the days after would bring new challenges, not just for her, but for both of us, and that the quiet resilience she carried would be tested in ways neither of us could yet imagine. The morning air held a crispness unusual for the season, the kind that brushed the skin and reminded you that the world moved on, whether you were ready or not. Dust curled lazily along the boardwalks, carrying the faint scent of sun-warmed hay and the iron tang of the blacksmith's forge. I rode slowly into town, not because I had any business there, but because something in me had woken earlier than usual, restless, uneasy. Her shadow waited by the boarding-house doorway, tall and careful in the rising light, and for a moment I wondered if the world itself had paused, holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Maribel Rowan stood straight, hands resting lightly on the doorframe. Her face was serene, but I could read the tension beneath the calm. Every small gesture measured, every movement deliberate. The town was waking around her, unaware or unwilling to see the quiet storm gathering in the space between us. I dismounted, the horse's hooves striking softly against the boards, and let the reins fall slack in my hands. My heart was steady, though my chest ached with words I had held too long. I called her name softly, and she turned, the faintest flicker of surprise passing across her features. Not because I had ever withheld my presence, she was used to seeing me, but because the tone of my voice carried something she had not yet heard: intention. I took a step toward her, then another, each one deliberate, conscious of the eyes that might be on us, but caring little for their judgment. This moment was ours, private despite the street that held its gaze. "Maribel," I said, voice low, steady. "I have waited too long to tell you this." The words trembled slightly, not with doubt, but with the weight of truth. She studied me quietly, her lips pressed in a faint line, her eyes reflecting caution and curiosity in equal measure. I saw then how the past had shaped her, how every expectation of humiliation had left a shadow she wore as armor. "I have watched," I continued. "Watched you endure what others thought you would not, watched you move through their judgments and remain whole. And I have realized something I cannot ignore any longer." My hands tightened briefly on the reins before I let them fall again. The quiet of the morning pressed around us, each sound, the distant clatter of a harness, the low murmur of a street lamp's wind chime, sharpening the clarity of what I needed to say. She blinked once, softly, as though weighing the words, measuring them against the distance we had both walked, the trials endured, the silent conversations shared through work and quiet glances. The sun glinted off the brass hinges of the boarding-house door, light scattering across her hair, and in that moment, the world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. I took another step closer, careful not to overstep, careful not to frighten the fragile hope in her eyes. "I choose you," I said simply. No flourish, no grand declaration, just the truth laid bare. "I choose you for every day you have endured, for every quiet act of courage I have seen, for the person you are when no one is watching. I do not seek to save you, because you have been saving yourself all along. I wish only to be beside you, to witness it and to share it." Her breath caught then, a soft, almost inaudible sound that broke the tension like a single note in a silent hall. She took a hesitant step toward me, eyes wide, heart visible in the way she allowed her guard to slip just slightly. The world seemed to shift in that moment, the dust, the sun, the distant voices, all fading to a blur of light and warmth around the quiet certainty between us. I reached for her hand, slow, reverent, giving her every chance to withdraw. She did not. She let me take it, fingers curling gently around mine, a small but profound act of trust. It was enough to steady me, enough to fill the hollows left by months of watching, waiting, and fearing that I had arrived too late. The town stirred faintly, doors opening, voices shifting, but we were insulated by the gravity of what had been said. I could feel her pulse, steady but quickened by anticipation, and I knew that every moment of ridicule, every small cruelty had led us here, to the cusp of something neither of us had dared to name aloud. "I cannot promise the town will understand," I whispered, voice roughened by feeling. "But I can promise that I will stand beside you. Every morning, every evening, every quiet moment in between." She lifted her chin then, eyes glistening, a faint, tremulous smile breaking through the careful restraint she had worn for so long. The armor she carried began to fall away, piece by piece, revealing a resilience that was breathtaking in its simplicity. Clinton's shadow had faded from the street, irrelevant now, and the weight of judgment seemed lighter, dissipated by the undeniable truth of our choice. I pressed my forehead briefly against hers, careful, reverent, and she leaned into it, just enough to acknowledge the bond forming between us. Words were no longer necessary. The quiet assertion of presence, of recognition, of unspoken devotion, carried the weight of every struggle endured and every act of endurance witnessed. The day stretched around us, golden light filtering through the boardwalk beams, dust motes suspended like tiny stars. I realized then, with clarity that cut sharper than any blade, that love is not a matter of grand gestures or public acclaim. It is a quiet, deliberate choosing, repeated daily, seen in the care given, the trust extended, the presence maintained. And in that understanding, I felt the first true relief I had known in months. That the choice had been made, that the courage to speak had met the courage to receive. We lingered there until the sun tilted westward, shadows stretching long across the street. The town moved around us, still and watchful, but powerless to alter what had been decided. Maribel's hand remained in mine, small but steady, and I could feel the subtle weight of her confidence building, a fragile but unstoppable force. I knew there would be days ahead when the streets would test us again, when whispers and glances would seek to erode this fragile peace. But for now, the victory was ours, quiet and unassailable. As I finally stepped back, allowing her to release my hand, I saw a softness in her gaze that had been absent before. The tension she had carried, the caution, the careful armor of endurance, had shifted. A small smile curved her lips, uncertain yet determined, and in that expression, I understood that the choice I had made was not mine alone. She had chosen it too. Every measured step, every act of resilience, had led her here, to trust, to hope, to possibility. The light fell behind the hills, spilling a golden glow across the street, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with us. I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new small tests, but in that suspended moment, everything felt aligned, everything right. I would stand beside her, as witness, as partner, as the man who finally saw her wholly. And as we turned toward the boarding house, the air thick with dusk and the promise of calm, I felt a certainty settle in my chest, quiet but unshakable. No shadow from the past, no cruelty from the town, no hesitation within myself could ever undo this choice. I had seen her, truly seen her, and I had chosen to remain, every day, beside the woman who had endured more than most could imagine. And in that choosing, I found a life I would never relinquish,